Should the librarian attack you, do not hesitate to shoot at it once. If a single round has no effect, the last one is for you. For death is preferable to what it does to its victims, as I've already said. I will not, however, say what that is, because it might discourage you. If you do end up shooting yourself, the news coverage of your bizarre suicide or suicides in a ritualistic setting will be all I need for the last piece of data that I want to know about the entity before I destroy my research. As a kid, I was raised in a small fishing community on the eastern side of Canada, surrounded by the Gulf of St. Lawrence and Burrell Forest. The entirety of the land was close to 4,000 foot square, with an even smaller number of residents sprawled out over Main Street, the main road running straight through our little town, and farming houses spread wide between areas of trees that were changed to domestic residential homes when agriculture stopped being profitable. In total, our community is surrounded by a vast expanse of ocean, and a seemingly endless barrage of trees that spread over 55% of Canada's entire country. I spent most of my life hunting in those woods, so you can imagine my joy when my parents got me a hunting dog. Sandy was a Shetland sheepdog, and while they were more fit to be herding and tracking sheep over grassy plains rather than rabbits and deers through dense forest, it didn't stop me from taking him with me on every excursion I possibly could. Sandy had been by my side for enough hunting trips that he'd grown accustomed to waking up just before breaking daylight, and on a few occasions, helped track down small game like squirrels and rabbits through considerably large areas of forest. Sandy wasn't my property, and wasn't treated like he belonged to me. Sandy was a member of the family, my best companion, and my truest friend. I think back on all the times he'd sit in the front seat of the truck without being told, ready to go for a walk in whatever part of the forest I told him to. I can honestly say there'll never be a dog that will fill the void Sandy left in my life. I find that dog lovers relate to that sentiment more than others. It was October 30th, the first day of deer hunting season. I had been talking with my family about taking Sandy, my hunting gear, and a few essentials to one of the cabins my grandfather owned in his heyday off an unmarked road a few hundred miles into the wilderness for a few days. This was met with a lot of protesting, but nothing could stop me from getting in some time looking for wild game in an area that wasn't already picked clean by illegal hunters earlier in the month. Everything was packed into the old blue Ford, Sandy included, and a few hours of driving later, we were setting up camp in one of my grandfather's secluded old cabins. Here's where things got fucked up. Sandy, I'm so sorry. I had spent most of the time of my life being in the wilderness. There were only a handful of times that things had gotten weird for me, but usually everything could be explained with scientific reason. That's why I brushed off Sandy's weirdness in the first few nights, chalking it up to the nervousness of a dog that's capable of hearing the far-off noises of various coyotes, wolves, bears, and moose. This was untouched territory, of course. There had been plenty of time for wildlife to set up camp here, too. The first night was fairly normal. I had set up Sandy's bed in the corner of the living room next to the TV that looked like it had come from the early 90s. I figured I'd give Sandy the option to have some place to lay down for a while, despite the fact that he slept curled up with me 9 times out of 10. Close to 10 at night, Sandy looked straight at the wooden door and whined. I figured he needed to piss, and opened the door to let him out, not worried about having my best friend stray too far from me. Instead, he just sat inside the door, looking out at the forest edge beyond the path. I too stood and looked for a few minutes before deciding he had just heard an errant creature close to the cabin. The rest of the night was fairly normal, and Sandy slept with me fine. The second night, I chalked the weirdness up to Sandy's stress. Earlier that day, we had been walking a few miles through the woods beyond the house, and I thought I heard the sound of twigs cracking under something heavy. I hoped it wasn't a moose because my shotgun wouldn't have stood a chance, but something changed in Sandy that I didn't pay close attention to at the time. He hunched himself on his hind legs, his foot pressed close to the ground, his mouth pulled up over his teeth, and he growled towards nothingness. I figured we should try hunting later, if whatever it was had left, and should he be feeling up to it. But once we were inside, he didn't want to move. Even when I tried to get him up to go outside to do his business, he sat at the door and cried, wailing at me to let me know he didn't want to go out there. I didn't pressure him. If he pissed on the floor, so be it. Sandy never acted up before. I could excuse an accident or two if he really didn't want to be out there. It must have been a bear, I thought, before locking the door and calling it a night. The third night is where things went to hell, listeners. And I still don't fully understand what happened. Sandy didn't eat all day. I managed to shoot a rabbit in the early morning, and when Sandy decided he didn't want to be outside any longer than he had to, and retired inside for the day, I cooked it up, threw a little gravy on it, and gave it to my dog. I didn't do this all the time, but I figured now was a special occasion. Maybe a treat would put him in a better mood for another walk the next day. Sandy didn't touch it. He didn't so much as sniff it. Instead, he sat at my side on the couch, watching the doorway intently. I tucked him under my arms, and he laid his head on my lap, eyes still locked on the door. Close to 3 hours of watching grainy VHS tapes on an outdated television set, Sandy started crying, hugging himself close to my body. Now, this is where my judgment took me down the wrong path the first time of many. It must sound silly being my dog's protector rather than my dog being mine, but this was my family. I figured if there was something out there that was scaring Sandy so bad, then it was my job to do something about it. I loaded my .410, opened the door, and stood in the doorway and waited. I must have waited at least a half hour staring into nothing. There was barely any sound save for the faint buzz of insects and leaves rustling in the cold autumn wind. Moose aren't elegant creatures, and if it were a moose, I would have heard it coming. Around the 40-minute mark, Sandy took off like a shot into the darkness of the trees beyond the path, barking wildly. I started to get worried. Despite my knowledge that my dog isn't entirely helpless in the wilderness, there was bigger animals that would have liked to take a bite out of him if there wasn't a lot of food for the winter. I heard Sandy's barks fade away into the distance, and then stop altogether. I waited hours, standing in the doorway with my shotgun cocked and ready to put down whatever it was that was waiting in the woods. I waited hours for Sandy to come back to the house. I waited until sun was cracking through the trees, and then I waited until that night, sitting on my porch step, feigning off sleep deprivation to see my dog come back. Sandy did come back. But not for another 3 days. Fog had rolled in at that point, and it was getting darker. The night painted the sky a navy blue. Tracking over the last few days proved futile, and I started to get worried that I need to leave and find more provisions to last me the next few nights. I couldn't leave Sandy up there, lost in the woods, cold and probably hungry. The thought that he might be waiting out there for me to find him and bring him back home was distressing enough. I was packing the bag that hung on the coat rack next to the door with what I'd need for the next day's trip. I figured tomorrow would be the last day before I'd go into town and see if my father would help me find Sandy. He was a retired graying man, but I was sure if I brought up Sandy's name, he'd be more than willing to help me search for him. Thankfully, Sandy came back before I'd even finished that train of thought. I saw him from the window on the porch that led down the main road a few dozen feet away from the house. Normally I'd hear him scamper up to the doorway and paw at the door a few times, eager to come in, but this was different. I could see the reflection of his eyes as green pearls in the murky fog that had swamped the house. For a moment I thought it might be an animal, but the outline of his body in the wisps of thick, low-lying clouds was unmistakable. Still, despite myself, I hesitated. There was something different about his body language. I stared out the window for a few more moments before reason overcame my gut instinct. Sandy could be hurt, I thought. Or worse. I flung the doorway open, but he didn't come right away. Instead, he stood there, watching me intently, and when he didn't move, I whistled to him. "Here, Sandy." I coaxed him toward the house. "Here, boy." The way he moved was different. It was as though his hips had been dislocated, and the angle of his paws changed direction with every step, as though he'd forgotten how to walk properly. His head was bowed to the ground, but his teeth weren't bared. He didn't seem aggressive. The only way I could describe the way he looked was sheepish. Like he'd just gotten into something he wasn't supposed to, and I yelled at him for it. I thought he might have hurt himself hopping up onto the elevated step if he dislocated his hips, but he did just fine. His back half swung a little, oddly enough, and his paws almost folded underneath himself, but he didn't go sprawling. He sat on the step and didn't take his look off me. It wasn't until I moved from the doorway completely, opened the door wide, and waited for him to walk in that he moved. Straight to his bed. He didn't stop at my hand and sniff at me. He didn't wait for pets or jump up on me like usual. He was straight to his bed, where he sat and watched me for quite some time afterward. I returned to the movie at hand. I called him a few times, but he didn't respond. His ears didn't so much as raise to the sound of my voice, or the pat of my hand on the worn-out couch beside me. I had missed my buddy, but I wasn't about to move him physically toward me. There was something about him that said I shouldn't have let him in. But I chalked it up to silliness, and a few hours later I went to bed. The more I think back on it, I don't recall him blinking once. He sat there like a statue, and when I turned off the light, I could see the reflection of jade green following me as I went into my room and shut the door. I could have sworn I heard him walk in the night. The sound of nails clicking against the wooden floor coming up to the door of my room, but they were slow and deliberate. They weren't like the quickness of Sandy realizing I'd gone to bed and coming to curl up. I heard the noises stop outside of my bedroom, but I didn't hear his whine. I thought nothing of it and fell into a deep sleep. When I woke in the morning, I figured it must have been a dream. Sandy was still sitting in that upright position I left him in when I went to bed. It was as though he hadn't moved a muscle the entire night, and when I said good morning, he didn't so much as wag his tail. He did follow me into the kitchen, but he paused at the doorway when I put his bowl down on the floor and filled it up with supermarket dog food. Once again, his back half moved weirdly as he slowly made his way towards me. There was a nagging feeling that something was off-putting about the way that he looked that day. It was like... It was like he'd gotten a little longer overnight. Sandy hunched down again, like when he was walking to the door that night. He didn't come into the kitchen. I figured he must have been hungry being out in the wild for so long, but he eyed me like he was waiting for me to come a little closer, rather than touch the food. It goes without saying, but after a few moments of a staring contest between me and my unblinking dog, I called off that foolishness and called his name out loudly. Not even a flinch. I didn't want to move closer to my dog to leave the kitchen door. But this was my Sandy, and the most damage he'd ever done was eat flies. Sure enough, as I passed him, he turned, and his body swayed unnaturally. But he didn't move towards me. When I left that day, I couldn't find anything. The deer tracks in the mud were made a few days prior and went cold off naturally made trails through the woods. I couldn't hear bugs, birds, or even the howl of a nearby coyote. The only sounds from miles away from the campfire site were my own breathing and the sound of crunching leaves underneath my feet. When the sun started to set, I started making my way back. But I should have just packed my shit and left. Just behind a cluster of trees, with the house just visible beyond the rise, I figured I'd found out the reason why the animals had abandoned this place. Generally, when there are mass animal deaths, that usually means that something is wrong in the area of the slaughter, and wildlife are usually smart enough to get the hell out of Dodge. Even cats are bred instinctively not to like drinking from water that is close to where their food is, because if you saw a dead animal near a stream, you'd figure the stream was tainted and find another source of water. Hundreds of squirrels were disemboweled and strewn across the grass in almost perfect circle. Most of them were skinned alive, but when I turned to heave up all the contents of my stomach, there were a few dozen that were inside out. I couldn't help but vomit repeatedly as I tried my best to walk around the circle of tiny organs and mashed up bodies. Not just over the sight, but because the smell was ungodly. I didn't know how long they'd been out there. If I'd stumbled across this sooner, I'd have left with Sandy in tow immediately after her. Gradually, the bodies stopped and delved off into a random dead squirrel here and there. The biggest thing I managed to find just a few feet off the unholy feeding ground was a deer. It looked as though something had decided to skin it alive from hide to neck and draped some kind of skin over a branch like someone was tanning the hide. I don't know how long it had been there, but it smelled like it had been dead for quite some time, despite the fact that there wasn't a single fucking fly. The head had been cut clean off just above the shoulders, and when I realized the organs had been removed, I moved from a walking pace through the forest to a jog. Thankfully, the cabin wasn't too far off. I heaved one final time, wiped my mouth off on the back of my sleeve, and looked up to the house to see Sandy. Watching me from the window. I tried to reason with myself. I tell myself Sandy's odd behavior could have been trauma. I know it's stupid to think of it now, but at the time, it was the only reasonable explanation that I had to keep myself from going insane. The elongating body could have just been loneliness getting to me. Sandy had realized there was something up with this place, and the second he noticed it, I should have taken this warning and taken off back into town. Once the door was shut behind me, I started packing the food and essentials back into boxes. Moving quickly to try and get my things into the truck before night came. It'd be dangerous to try and maneuver my way through the trails at night, as the hills off Kelly's Mountain were steep. And in pitch darkness, with my only companion being my headlights, it would have been easy to slide off a ravine and never be heard from again. I didn't want to stay one more night. But I had no choice. I had gotten back to the house just moments before the sun finally receded past the horizon, and we were bathed in a navy blue sky once again. I didn't pay attention to Sandy. He just sat at his bed and watched me pack. I figured, no harm, no foul. I'd throw his stuff into the truck in the morning and be back in town before night that next day. Glancing at him for a moment, there was a passing thought that he was looking a little longer today. And when I went to bed, it was a hard time getting to sleep for the next few hours. It must have been close to 4 or 5 in the morning when I finally heard it. The sound of whistling, the same whistling that I used to call my dog. I broke out into a cold sweat when I realized that whoever slaughtered those squirrels, hung the skin up, left what he didn't need, could have very well broken into my house. The door to my room didn't make a sound as I opened it slowly, thankfully. I waited a moment, listened to someone call my dog for a few more seconds before I dared poke my head out from the door frame just to get a good look at whoever it was that could have hurt Sandy. The outside door was open. All I saw was the back half of Sandy, too long and lanky, almost coiled around the back of the door. His front half was outside. Whatever it was that had impersonated my dog was whistling slowly, calling for Sandy. When I could have sworn that it had hunched down to the ground again and said, in the most ungodly voice I'd ever fucking heard. I closed the door just as softly as I opened it. I don't know how long I waited. With my back pressed up against the door, I knew I left my gun in the bag on that coat rack. I know I didn't sleep. I waited until I saw the sun break over the horizon, and then I waited some more until it must have been midday, and I finally got the balls to open the door again and make a break for the truck. I wouldn't die in that place. Sandy was gone, and the door was open. His food was untouched, but the fridge was open, and all the meat was gone. I didn't bother packing his stuff. I just threw my bag over my shoulder, made my way to the fort as fast as I could, turned on the ignition. I can't describe the feeling that overcame me as I realized that I'd have to leave Sandy in this place. The thought that he could be dead was never a thought in my mind. I don't think I could cope with the knowledge that whatever I allowed into my house, whatever disemboweled those animals, could have done the same to him. I made my way down the winding paths and roads as fast as I possibly could without veering off the cliffs. I felt like I was turning in circles down this labyrinth that would take me back to that house. But when I reached the pavement on the stretch of road back to town, I felt relief wash over me. Thinking I was safe. Just as I was pulling off onto the cement, I felt something hard hit the back windshield, sending broken glass into the passenger seat. I only got a glimpse of the deer's decapitated head catching on unbroken glass and tumbling into the back seat. And I cried for most of the way back home, hands clenching the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. I wish I could leave this off with a positive note. I wish I could tell you that I found Sandy at home waiting for me. I wish I could tell you that was the end of it, a traumatizing experience in the woods that I'd get over in time. Last night, I found it hard to sleep. I kept replaying the entirety of my trip to Kelly's Mountain in my head. I figured I wouldn't be sleeping for a while and laid there, listening to the wind through my open window. I could have sworn I heard the whistle I used to call my dog come from the forest edge. Go on trips with your dog, guys. I advise you don't let them out of your sight for too long. What comes back might not be your duck. It was 11, and the darkness in Ash's bedroom was suffocating. The young man twitched under his sheets whose thick cotton used to be a soft barrier from the harsh winter nights, but were now a boiling prison whose structure encased him like a hot, sweat-soaked coffin. Ash whimpered, or tried to. His tongue was thick and heavy, and it rested inside a papery throat that felt too atrophied to produce even the faintest of squeaks. All around him, the air was alive with sounds. The faint creak of the old floorboards, the wind whistling through the copse of withered trees outside his house, the faint drip of water in the tap, the creaking of the ice on his roof, the gusts of wind that blew tiny, hardened particles of ice onto his window, making a sound like fingernails tapping on the frozen glass. Off in the distance, faint and muffled by the winter gale, he heard, or thought he heard, a tree fall. The sound sent a jolt of terror coursing through his body. He imagined a tall, faceless, shadowy thing striding through the snowy forest, pushing aside trees and snapping them like the thin twigs they produced. He imagined that at any moment a long, pale arm would shoot through the window that lay above his headboard, an arm that ended in an inhuman claw that groped for him with long fingers like the legs of a spider. Again, Ash tried to whimper, to express his fears in some way, to distract him from the sounds. But his lungs felt as if the soft meat of their make had been replaced with lead. Another torrent of tiny tapping sounds assaulted his windows. Some part of him knew that it was only ice and snow, but his mind betrayed him, and the image of a massive beetle, bloated and dark against the white snow, skittering across the window, trying to find a way in, came to his mind. Ash felt the floodgates of his imagination, well fed by movies and books, began to buckle as thoughts and images that he knew would keep him up throughout the night began to press against what little willpower remained of his exhausted mind. Please. Please don't. Not tonight. Please, he begged silently. There was a mental haze of fear. Then there came the sound of nails on the floorboards, accompanied by a heavy pig-like snuffling. That wall broke, and his imagination began to weave tapestries of horror inside of his mind. He saw a massive, rotting creature with twisted limbs like ancient tree roots lumbering up the stairs, heading for his room. Its talons clicked on the floor as fetid breath gurgled out through rotting teeth from the depths of soil-clogged lungs. He saw a massive spider, with more legs than could be counted, scurrying along the floor with its yellow eyes staring through the door. Through his sheets, past his skin and muscle to gaze hungrily at his rapidly beating heart. The spider gave way to a thin woman, with sagging leathery skin, and legs like a wolf padding closer and closer with a predator's stealth. From the woman came a small, skinless thing that could have been an infant. Save for its many eyes. The door opened. Ash's lungs let out a single, solitary moan that exited through his lips as a reedy whimper. A heavy body sprang onto the bed, its weight crushing his legs before it began to move upward. A single second later, he felt its hot breath on his cold skin. Ash looked into the darkness and saw two large brown eyes staring inquisitively back at him. It was his golden retriever, Max. Ash felt the terror rush out of his lungs on the current of a relieved sigh. He reached out with his arms that were finally wonderfully mobile and embraced the dog, feeling its warm, far and heavy breaths through its sturdy barrel. Max buried his soft head into his master's chest and whined softly. Ash stroked the dog's head and let his relieved tears flow, vowing to go to his psychiatrist as soon as he could the following day in order to procure whatever medication he could. His relief deafened him to the note of fear in the dog's soft whimpers, and blinded him to the fact that Max's arthritic old joints made his ascending the stairs to the second floor a rarity. The sound of Max's hammering heart masked the sound of the soft footsteps on the stairs, and the curtain of tawny fur concealed the shadow, one a shade darker than the others, that stood just outside his doorway. But Ash heard the flick of the switchblade, heard it clearly as it banished all other minor sounds, leaving him in a world of dreadful silence. Then came the sound of soft, excited breaths. The shadow moved into the room. The switchblade gleamed in the moonlight. And Ash wished that the monsters of his imagination had been real all along. The dictionary describes a serial murder as the unlawful homicide of at least two people, carried out in a series over a period of time. Serial murder differs from mass murder, in which several victims are murdered at the same time and place. Criminologists have distinguished between two types of serial murder: classic serial murder, which usually involves stalking and is often sexually motivated, and spree serial murder, which is usually motivated by thrill-seeking. Ed Gein was a serial murderer in both senses. Ed Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse, Wisconsin. Ed was the youngest of two boys. His older brother Henry was killed in 1943 during a house fire. His father was George Gein, who died of his alcoholism in 1940, leaving Ed to care for his mother, Augusta, alone. They lived in a farm in Plainsville, Wisconsin. Augusta was a demanding, overbearing woman who had full control over her son. From as far back as Ed could remember, Augusta was either delegating farm work for the boys to perform or quoting the gospel. She tried hard to teach Ed about sin, especially about the sins of sex and women. For 2 years he tended to her demands until her death in 1945. Ed, now alone, sealed himself away from the outside world and contained himself in the kitchen and living room of the farmhouse. Ed filled his time fantasizing about the sins his mother warned him about and learned the female anatomy. The more he learned, the more his sexual obsession grew. These twisted fantasies became more so when he learned of the Nazi camps and the experiments and dismemberments done to Jewish prisoners. To fulfill this sick appetite, Gein started robbing graves for body parts. For over 10 years, Ed Gein had robbed so many graves that even he lost count. This included his own mother's grave. The experiments with the corpses became more gruesome and bizarre over time, and included necrophilia and cannibalism. Gein's obsessive fantasies centralized on his desire to turn himself into a woman. He would construct items out of the skin of the bodies that he could then drape on himself, such as female masks and breasts. He even made a complete body-sized female suit made up of flesh of the dead. As growing insanity usually does, Ed believed that the only way to perfect his craft, complete his transformation from male to female, and further his experimentation, was to use living human bodies. In 1957, Gein entered the hardware store owned by Bernice Worden. Gein had been to this same store hundreds of times, and Bernice had no reason to fear him. She likely thought nothing when Gein removed a .22 rifle from the display rack. What she didn't see was Ed inserting his own bullet into the gun, taking aim, and killing Bernice in her own store. Ed stuffed her body into the truck, took the store register, and left. Bernice Worden was Ed Gein's mistake. Her son Frank was a deputy sheriff. He discovered her missing late that night and the unclean blood from the gunshot earlier that day. Frank Worden followed the breadcrumbs to the home of Ed Gein. Ed Gein was located by the police and taken in for questioning at the store near his home. Police then went to Gein's farmhouse in hopes of finding Bernice Worden. In the middle of the night, the search of the Gein farm began. Officer Shelley led the search to the Gein farm shed. Lit by torchlight, he entered the shed to find a scene right out of a horror film. Inside was a woman's naked corpse hanging upside down, the body disemboweled, and the throat and head missing. It was the body of Bernice Worden. In the Gein house, the police officers waded through piles of garbage and an unfathomable amount of junk, with only oil lamps to guide them. As the officers' eyes adjusted, the junk began to take a recognizable form, one that was more horrific than anyone could have ever imagined. In every corner of the room were various body parts, some used as household items, such as skulls made into bowls, jewelry made from human skin, and a chair seat with human skin upholstery. Others included 4 random noses, whole human bones and fragments thereof, 9 masks of human skin, 10 female heads with the tops sawed off, Bernice Worden's head in a burlap sack, 9 vulvas in a shoebox, skulls on his bedpost, organs in the refrigerator, a pair of lips on a drawstring for a window shade, a belt made up of human female nipples, a lampshade made from the skin from a human face. And one of the most shocking items found was that of Bernice Worden's heart, found in a pan on the stove. The 2 murders that Ed Gein could be convicted of was the murder of Bernice Worden in 1957, whose body was found decapitated and disemboweled in the farmhouse, and the murder of Mary Hogan in 1954, whose face was found in a bag in the house. The body parts of 15 different women were found around the Gein farm, along with many others that could not be identified. Ed Gein stated that he could not recall how many people he murdered. he would never admit to his acts of cannibalism, nor necrophilia. Geen was committed to South Bend State Hospital for the duration of his life. At age 78, Geen died of cancer and his remains were buried in Plainsville, Wisconsin. It raises many a question. What would drive Ed Geen to such insanity? Was it the isolation and loss of his family? The doctors of Waupun State believed that it had stemmed from the relationship Ed had with his mother. But the fact remains that Ed Geen, as much as we would love to distance ourselves from him, was human, like you or I. Would that mean that someone like you or I were capable of doing the unspeakable terrors that he did? Only time will tell. It might happen one morning that you wake up home alone. This could be normal depending on your situation, but this morning will be different. All your environment will all seem exactly the same. You'll notice that everything is quieter than normal. If you go outside, you'll notice a distinct lack of anything like birds, insects, or people. As far as you travel, you will not encounter another sentient human being. The entire world will be intact, but empty, except for yourself. There are currently over 100,000 missing persons cases in the United States. Some are just normal cases of murder or kidnapping, but in others, the disappearance can't be explained, and no remains of the person are ever located. The Ocean's Cool Air by Vincent Vinacava. I stared up and into the heavens. Stars dotted the evening sky like little white splotches of paint, haphazardly splattered across a black canvas of some wannabe artist believing himself to be the second coming of Jackson Pollock. It reminded me of the type of piece one might find in a terrible surrealist art gallery where pretentious hipsters sip $2 chuck out of plastic cups, hoping their idiotic interpretations of each exhibition will make each other think they're more intelligent than they actually are. On a nearly moonless night, the tiny twinkling specks of light were the only things illuminating the darkness brought on by dusk. I had grown to look forward to nightfall. The days had become unbearable due to the constant bombardment of UV rays that I had been forced to endure. The evening's cool air tended to my damaged skin and gave me reprieve from the daily beatings I took from the sun. The night also provided constellations, which had become a welcome distraction. The stars told stories. Stories that helped me forget. Forget about the decrepit old lifeboat in the middle of the ocean that I was stranded in. I barely noticed the commercial fishing boat as it approached my dinghy, a testament to how far gone my mind had become from the weeks of isolation out at sea. Even to this day, I don't know how they managed to spot my tiny boat, shrouded in the vast darkness of the open ocean.
Hey there! Are you okay?
The young man was looking down at me from the bow of the ship. His piercing blue eyes almost glowed in contrast to the black sky behind him. Upon further inspection, I could see the whiskers that had begun to sprout from his face. A result of going days without shaving while out in the water. As he scratched his stubbly chin, more of the crew crowded around the front of the boat to take a gander at me. I suppose a half-dead man marooned out at sea was the strangest sight they'd seen in quite a while. In honor or that I would hold for the briefest of moments.
"He's alive!" one of the fishermen shouted. Get him up here now!"
As I watched the crew frantically buzz around the ship's deck like a bunch of worker bees, trying to figure out how to bring me aboard. A laugh escaped my mouth. Not a loud, bellowing one, mind you, just a tiny giggle. It was the irony of the situation that I'd found comical. Perhaps that last little chuckle was the humor center of my brain finally fading from the weeks of emotional agony that I'd sustained. Going out not with a bang, but with a whimper. Just a tiny giggle.
It started with a loud crash across the starboard side of the boat. The fishermen struggled to retain their footing when the powerful impact caused their vessel to rock onto its side and nearly capsize. Shouts and expletives streamed from the mouths of the startled sailors as I watched them desperately try to make sense of what had occurred. Another thunderous clang rang along the side of their ship, and this time it tipped. The once silent ocean air was now filled with the sounds of chaos as the trawling smashed across the surface of the sea, flipping completely upside down and sending the men toppling overboard into the cold, murky water. I struggled to lift my head in order to peer over the side of my dinghy at the anarchy taking place around me. The fishermen barely had a chance to breach and catch their breaths before it began pulling them back down into the abyss. Their panic quickly intensified as one by one they started to realize the crewmates were disappearing into the deep, dark sea. You never truly experienced pandemonium until you've heard a dozen grown men screaming for their lives in the middle of the ocean. The young man who had first greeted me from the ship's bow thrashed and kicked through the water, urgently trying to make his way towards my lifeboat. With salvation merely inches away, he flailed his arms wildly, reaching and grasping with reckless abandon, attempting to grab onto the side. I watched the hope in those piercing blue eyes of his turn to hopelessness as a black sludge-covered tentacle wrapped itself around his ankle and yanked him back down under with one quick jerk. It was the fishing boat's turn now. Still submerged, the sea beast easily crumpled the already twisted hunk of metal before sinking it down to the watery graveyard at the bottom of the briny deep. There it would join the countless other vessels that had shared a similar fate. Without warning, the massive creature erupted from the surface of the sea. I wondered briefly if the salty taste from the water that splashed my face when the beast made its appearance stemmed from the ocean itself, or the blood of the men who died in it. I shut my eyes, hoping not to catch a glimpse of its horrible features. The sound of water trickling around the Leviathan's body as it waded towards my lifeboat caused me to wince in fear. Though my eyes were clenched tight, I could still feel its awful presence as it closed in on me. I gagged and choked as the rancid smell of its hot breath forced its way into my nostril and down my throat. With a thud, it dropped a mangled human limb across my lap, one of the fisherman's arms to be precise. It spoke only one word, the same word that it had said to me many times before, and the same word it would repeat many times after.
Eat.
And with that, it slithered back into the sea, leaving me to myself again. I opened my eyes and stared down at the mutilated piece of flesh lying across my sunburnt thighs. For a moment, I was tempted to throw it back overboard, but thought the better of it, fearing retaliation from the creature for not listening to its commands. For whatever reason, it seemed to want me alive, but I wasn't about to test its patience. I sunk my teeth into the skin and tore a chunk of muscle from its bone. It had been a week since I had last eaten. The hunger pains in my stomach seemed to subdue the horrors in my mind and made the atrocity of cannibalism slightly easier.
I let out a sigh and looked back up to the starry night. I was alone again. And once more, silence reigned over the ocean's cool air.
In rural, southern Illinois, is a toy company that began selling realistic baby dolls to expectant mothers. But apparently, after the mother had her child, the toy baby would start crying. Eventually, the rocking motion advertised to calm it down wouldn't work, so you couldn't get it to stop without shaking it. And eventually, when it started crying, the parent would have to beat it. And the beatings and thrashings would have to get harder and harder to get it to be quiet. The only thing that seemed to shut the baby doll up permanently was to bash its head against the wall to destroy whatever mechanism triggered the crying. On more than one occasion, though, neighbors called the authorities to report child abuse, and when the police arrived, they found the bloody remains of infants smeared across the walls and the floor. In most cases, the mothers couldn't understand why the police were there. She just got rid of the stupid doll. As she rocked a baby-shaped bundle in her arms.
For as long as I can remember, I've always loved building things with clay. My favorite thing to play with as a child was Play-Doh. I would spend entire afternoons molding different items, animals and people, without ever getting bored. As I grew older and matured, my passion for sculpting grew with me, and by age 11, I was already taking pottery and precious metal clay classes with adults, mostly 4 times my age. It didn't matter to me that most of my friends weren't interested at all in what I did. The act of creating, glazing, firing pieces captivated my imagination. And while most kids my age wanted a game system or trendy clothes or shoes, I was bugging my folks for my own pottery wheel. I came from modest means, but luckily, both my parents supported my passion, and by the time I was 13, my bedroom was more like an art studio that happened to have a bed in it. All my time and effort was paying off too, and the pieces I made began to become more high quality more often. In fact, by my freshman year in high school, I was confident enough in my skills that I began to look into submitting my art for contests, making pots, vases, sculptures for friends and relatives as gifts. That was the beginning of the dark path I've walked down up to this very day. I first noticed it on a bowl that I made for my uncle for his 57th birthday. When I was 14, my dad told me his older brother had been a heavy smoker for most of his life. But the day my now 18-year-old cousin had been born, he smoked his last Camel. He wasn't looking back. I thought this was a great accomplishment, so I wanted to incorporate it into the piece that I was making for him. I used a different colored glaze for his initials within the bowl than I used for the rest of it, and then I designed the piece to have some cracks in it after firing. My plan was to try out the art style of kintsugi. That translates to gold joinery, and it's an art style from Japan. Kintsugi is the art of fixing broken pottery with a special lacquer that's powdered with gold, silver, or platinum. It's supposed to be a means of recognizing a piece's unique history by highlighting the cracks and flaws instead of hiding them, but turning those flaws into beauty and making the piece even more unique than it previously was. So my idea was to have a piece like that for my uncle, to show my esteem for him on how far he'd come in his past when it came to his own health. Something went wrong, though. Something I couldn't explain, and all the research in the world couldn't answer. The special lacquer, though it was powdered with gold, came out as a black obsidian. I was completely bewildered at the spectacle before me. As I said, all the research turned up nothing, but the bowl itself wasn't a failure, in my opinion. It seemed to have a dark beauty about it, and the special lacquer turned black instead of gold. That was only something that heightened the uniqueness in my eyes. I ended up giving it to my uncle for his birthday, and he was absolutely thrilled with it. 6 months later, my uncle was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. After 3 months of intense treatments, his body couldn't handle it anymore, and he passed away. The whole family was devastated. I was given a week off from school so my parents and I could travel across the country and attend his funeral. It was a hard fact to swallow. My uncle's death and the fact that we were staying in my now widowed aunt's house for the trip made it worse. It's hard to get to sleep when you can hear your aunt crying quietly to herself in her now lonesome bed. More than once, I was shedding tears too, as I was drifting off to sleep. It was on the last day there that I did a little snooping in my aunt's room. My parents had taken her out for breakfast earlier in the morning. Wouldn't be back till later, so I decided to see if there was any memorabilia of my uncle I'd like to see before I may never see it again. One of the first things I noticed was the bowl I made for him, displayed proudly, front and center on the dresser. Couldn't help but smile at the memory of giving it to him. I then decided to look a little bit in his desk, off in a corner of the room. I know I probably shouldn't have, but I was a teenager filled with angst at the time. I didn't see any issue doing what I did. Going through his drawers, I didn't find anything of interest until I saw a very large envelope from the hospital. In opening it, I found it was the x-rays of his chest from when they discovered the cancer. Holding them up to the window with the morning light shining through, I grimaced at the sight of his lungs filled with long, black streaks that showed the damage his years of smoking had done. As I looked more, though, a wave of familiarity washed over me. I'd seen this somewhere. I knew I had. I continued staring in hopes that it would hit me, but the knowledge evaded me, and I ended up trying to toss the x-ray across the room in frustration. It flapped through the air a bit and then landed on the floor in front of the dresser. With a sigh, I walked over and picked it up, but as I stood from bending over, my eyes fell upon the bowl again, and everything clicked. Every blackened crevice, every vein of obsidian that was in that bowl looked like it had been transplanted directly from the x-ray. I looked back and forth between the bowl and the x-ray in shock. There was no way this could be happening, yet evidence was right there in front of my face. I ended up saying nothing, trying to dismiss what I had discovered as some weird coincidence. Move on with my life. I kept up with my pottery and sculpting, but never attempted kintsugi again. I just couldn't bring myself to do it, and would just end up recycling any broken pieces back into clay. Fortunately, I didn't have to do this very often, as my skill had increased by leaps and bounds, and rare was the time anything I made broke. During summer break after my freshman year, one of my old friends, a boy I'd known since elementary school, asked me to make something for him. Now, he was a huge nerd, into card games, Dungeons & Dragons, anime, all that stuff. He wanted me to make a dragon or an ornate goblet for him. But I decided to do something different. I made a nice vase and glazed, so that it would look like there was a Japanese cherry blossom on both sides. I'd done things like this before on other work, so when I got it back from firing, I was a little confused. Everything seemed normal, except the cherry blossoms on the tree. Now, I knew I'd used a pink glaze on them, but they were instead blood red. Not only that, they weren't in the pattern that I'd originally glazed them in. I knew from experience that sometimes glazing doesn't work out exactly how you envisioned it, but this was different from anything I'd experienced. Plus, the new pattern the glaze had taken looked very disturbing to me. I couldn't place it at the time, but something about it evoked a primal disgust in me. And I wanted to destroy the vase right then and there. Unfortunately, my friend was with me when I got the piece back from firing, and he told me that he absolutely loved it, even when I pointed out the changed color and the weird pattern of the leaves. He told me he didn't see anything wrong with the vase. And even if it wasn't what I originally planned for it, he didn't care. He was so excited about the vase that I decided to just be happy that he liked his gift. I wonder, to this day, if I had been more aggressive in my complaints, had broken it right then and there, if it would have changed things. I found out what happened to him on the first day of sophomore year. The principal came on the loudspeaker to announce that he had passed. And it was a day or two later that I found out that the day before school started, he